It's worth noting that there's a lot of comments that make it seem like these Republican-led bills are the ones that are creating massive change, but that's not true. What these bills do is simply reverse the extreme changes proposed by the EPA. This is what we're proposing here is maintaining and preserving the current way of life that many Americans enjoy, and simply pointing out that there are some serious costs to these extreme changes that the EPA wants to implement. And they're looking at those costs through rose-colored glasses and not taking into account the full extent. I heard before that public health is about weighing costs and benefits. Totally agree. But you actually have to look at all the data if you're going to do that properly. And what the data suggests from the EPA's own website is that, look, if this is purely about air quality, well, air quality has increased in quality by almost 80% over the last 50 years. There isn't some air quality crisis all of a sudden. That's just false to say that. By every measure, air quality has improved drastically over the last 50 years, and it had nothing to do with EVs. The push towards EVs seems to be more about an obsession, without really any benefit to speak of. Now, there are some downsides. There is no indication that EVs are ever going to get any cheaper. They're far more expensive than combustible engine vehicles right now. They're on an uptrend, not a downtrend. Despite their more widespread use, their costs have increased. So if this is about saving the people who are in downtrodden communities, who are disenfranchised, all you're doing is making their transportation more expensive. There's also no indication that we're going to solve the problem of trying to charge these things on an already stressed grid system. Where are you going to get all the extra electricity? And we've been warned about this by the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, among other grid operators. You're also not taking into account the fact that to build a single EV battery requires the mining and processing of more than 500,000 pounds of material. That's 10 times more than the roughly 25,000 pounds of petroleum that an internal combustion engine uses over the life of a car. You have to dig up 500,000 pounds of earth just to make one of these things. And you got to do it all over the world, and it's usually done with slave labor. And then it's got to be processed. And so you're emitting actually 70% more emissions, carbon dioxide emissions, to build a single EV than to build a combustion engine vehicle. 70% more. That statistic comes from the EV manufacturers themselves, who do a proper accounting of the entire supply chain. So in the short term, EVs actually increase carbon dioxide emissions. It takes about 70,000 miles for them to break even with an internal combustion engine vehicle. Those are the facts. Those are the trade-offs. If we're going to say that we're considering trade-offs, and then what's the benefit? Again, some magical health benefit? Some fixing of this air quality crisis? Look, some cities I'm sure have that air quality crisis. Then those cities should deal with it. There's ways to do that, right? If the mayor of Los Angeles wants to tax their people and buy everyone an EV, that's on you. That's not a federal government problem. That's not what we should be doing up here. We don't impose costs on the entirety of the population, on the whole of American people, just because you think there's some potential possible health benefit that you can't really articulate exactly in a couple locations. When you talk about costs and benefits and trade-offs, that's how you should talk about it, with all the facts, not just the ones you like. I yield back. Thank you.
I just have to say, I mean, I respect the gentleman from Texas, I really do, but I disagree with his facts and his analysis. I mean, the fact is that last week was the hottest week ever recorded. When I was home for July 4th, I read it in the newspaper. It said that July 3rd was the hottest day ever recorded. July 4th, Independence Day, was hotter even than July 3rd. So the fact is that the droughts, the wildfires, the hurricanes, extreme heat continue to rise around the country and around the world, for that matter. And the effects of these are being felt by our constituents. They're costing us billions of dollars every year. The climate crisis is real, and the continued infusion of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere has to be addressed. I mean, those are facts. So, you know, I know the gentleman said that it's extreme to want to change the status quo. Let's continue with the status quo. But I would say the opposite. It's not extreme. It's irresponsible, in my opinion, to continue with the status quo when faced with all these crises. There is a crisis. It's not a made-up crisis. The crisis is real. And, I mean, all you have to do is, you know, step outside, at least where I am, or, you know, see the kinds of problems that we're facing. So I don't think there's anything extreme. In fact, I'd say the opposite. I don't think it's responsible to act as if we can just continue with the status quo. We can't. And yes, I agree that what these bills, this bill and others do, is to try to continue the status quo, which means you continue to use fossil fuels, you continue to put more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. I don't see how that's helpful. So in our efforts to try to change that, you know, we're just doing what we think is a responsible thing for the federal government, and federal government has the authority, in my opinion, to deal with this issue under the Clean Air Act and other legislation.
I thank the gentleman. I just want to respond briefly. So it was stated that my facts were incorrect. And I would say that the gentleman is certainly entitled to his own opinion, because that's exactly what was stated, was a series of opinions. I only stated facts, and I will repeat those facts, and they're indisputable. They're not subject to debate. They're simply facts. They're simply data and math and the science, and the facts are this. It does take 70% more emissions of carbon dioxide, which is a greenhouse gas, which you blame for climate change, right? I for one, want cleaner air. I want less carbon dioxide emissions in the world. So I look at this fact, a very hard, cold fact, and I say, how is it that we're saying that EVs are saving us from climate change by decreasing emissions, when in fact producing them produces 70% more emissions? Now, they break even eventually with an internal combustion engine vehicle at around 70,000 miles driven. Now, how long does that take? Especially considering when users of electric vehicles don't drive very far because they need charging stations, right? They're usually used in cities. So it is a fact, and it is an indisputable fact, that in the short term at least, producing EVs and largely moving towards their use will increase global emissions of carbon dioxide. That's not an opinion. It is a mathematical fact. Now, there's been two arguments used against these bills. One is that they reduce air particulates and increase air quality at a local level. Okay, that's true, right? You don't want to breathe in what comes out of a tailpipe, and if you're breathing around an EV, sure, the air qualities might be a little bit better. But the question, of course, is, are we really in a crisis? But then the second argument that was just used is that it's going to save us from climate change, but that's just not true because of the mathematical reasoning that I just stated. It's simply not true. It is not a matter of opinion. Our opinions are the same in the need to decrease overall emissions, but if that's our goal, then the last thing you want to do is massively produce a product that has more emissions than the products we are currently using. And I yield back to my friend from Pennsylvania.
Mr. Chair.